The spoon trembles once against porcelain before his voice settles into that practiced, gentle cruelty. Morning light slices through the half-open blinds, carving a thin bar of gold across the table, catching on the surface of his untouched coffee. I watch the line of light quiver each time the spoon taps a rhythm too delicate to belong to calm hands. He pretends not to notice the sound, or perhaps he pretends I don't notice it. Daniel is good at pretending good at shaping moments into performances where he plays a man with nothing to hide. Present tense tightens every breath between us, making the room feel smaller than it is. The soft scrape of the spoon becomes the only thing anchoring me to the table, while his voice drips with that practiced sweetness meant to disarm rather than comfort. He talks about trivial things, traffic, the weather, a client who never answers emails, his tone smooth, even warm if you don't listen too closely. But warmth doesn't land when it's built on top of something fractured. The reflection on the glossy table surface ripples faintly, a distortion caused by his shifting posture, and for a moment I can't tell if it's the light bending or the truth beneath his words. He lifts his mug with careful precision, as though afraid to disturb the fragile balance of this morning. I note how his eyes avoid mine, how they flick toward his phone each time the screen dims. There's an unspoken urgency in the way he keeps his thumb near the device, ready to turn it over should something flash across it. I pretend not to see. Pretending is a language we both understand. The air smells faintly of toasted bread, and the citrus cleaner he insisted on buying last week, too sharp for this early hour. His shoulders roll subtly, a gesture he uses when preparing to shift the conversation towards something sharper. I feel the familiar heaviness settle against my ribs. His cruelty never arrives loud. It slides in on quiet, well-articulated sentences dressed in soft edges and the kind of smile other people would call gentle. He clears his throat before speaking again, and the timing tells me the next words will not be accidental. I keep my gaze on the trembling spoon as he says something about how some people just don't handle responsibilities well, letting the implication hang between us like steam rising from his coffee. The line is mild enough to pass as commentary, yet pointed enough that I feel its edge. The spoon wavers again as if reacting on my behalf. For a moment, the light catches the reflection of his face in the porcelain-warped, elongated, unfamiliar, and I wonder if this distorted version is closer to the truth than the man sitting across from me. My pulse remains steady, trained from months of keeping myself still while navigating his shifting moods. His voice drifts into another gentle admonishment, thinly veiled as concern, each syllable hitting the air with soft cruelty meant to bruise without leaving visible marks. I absorb the words silently, letting them settle like dust over the table's reflective surface. Beneath the calm heat, coils low in my chest, quiet and deliberate. He doesn't see it. He never does. His gaze moves away again toward the window where the cut line of light sharpens across the table. The spoon trembles a third time, a subtle metallic quiver that betrays more than he intends. It's not nervousness, not guilt, just tension he hasn't realized has slipped into the muscles of his hand. I wonder what he thinks about in these moments, whether he's rehearsing the next careful remark or calculating how to keep the morning on his terms. He lifts the spoon and sets it down with a softness too intentional. Even gentleness with him is a controlled act. Cruelty delivered softly cuts deeper than anything shouted. The thought slips through me with the clarity of cold water, a truth I've learned to stop arguing with. His phone lights again screen, reflecting briefly across the table's polished surface before he turns it face down. He offers a thin smile, one that doesn't reach his eyes, and something about the angle of light makes the expression flatten into something hollow. I listen as he continues speaking each word, stepping carefully across a path only he knows. He thinks I'm absorbing his message as intended, that I will bend quietly as I have before, that this breakfast will end with the same fragile balance intact. But he doesn't see the way the light has shifted. He doesn't notice the steadiness in my breathing. He doesn't understand that silence can hold shape, purpose, and direction. Another tap of metal against porcelain carries through the space sharper this time, and he pauses mid-sentence as if finally hearing the sound himself. The reflection on the table stills the ripple, flattening into clarity for a brief moment. He mistakes my calm for submission. He always has. He has no idea how close the truth sits to the surface now, a thought steady and cold, settling into place with the quiet certainty of a closing latch. The room holds its breath with me, suspended between the tremor of that spoon and the next word he chooses. And as the light shifts again, gathering into a brighter, more revealing angle across the table, the morning stills into a single suspended moment where everything prepares to turn. The spoon trembles once more, sharper than before, as the world narrows to the space between us. I had always believed that mornings carried their own kind of honesty, a slow unwrapping of whatever truth the night tried to hide, and on the morning my certainty began to split, I found myself watching the bedroom light skim across objects that no longer felt like mine. I'm Emily Carter, 34, a marketing analyst from Portland, Oregon, and I had learned long ago that some revelations arrive quietly dressed in the softness of everyday routines. The mirror shard on my dresser caught the first sliver of daylight, its fractured edge glowing faintly as though somewhere inside it a breath waited to be released. It had broken weeks earlier when a frame slipped from my hands, and though I meant to throw the shard away, something about its sharp, unfinished edge made me keep it. That morning it shimmered strangely, reflecting a slanted beam across the dresser top. A faint reflection trembles across the glass edge. The line appeared and vanished like a flicker of thought, subtle enough that anyone else might have missed it. But I had grown sensitive to the language of small disruptions. Daniel's footsteps sounded down the hallway, steady, casual, the gait of a man who believed the day would fold neatly around him. I listened, letting the rhythm tell its own story before he even reached the doorway. He paused outside the bedroom for a moment, long enough that I wondered if he were adjusting his expression to something planned. When he finally stepped in, he offered a greeting that should have felt normal. The tone, however, lacked weight, like he was reading lines from a script written for someone who barely knew me. His hair was still damp from the shower, and the lingering scent of his cologne drifted through the air, familiar, yet altered as though its usual warmth had thinned into something sharper. He asked about my plans for the day. I answered simply. We exchanged harmless words, a choreography so polished between us that it could have belonged to two strangers performing marriage for an audience that wasn't there. The mirror shard reflected the tilt of his shoulder, slicing the image into a distorted triangle. I watched as his reflection moved slightly out of sync with him, a visual echo that felt too symbolic for comfort. He didn't notice. Daniel rarely noticed anything that didn't serve his narrative. The kitchen was brighter than usual when I walked in after him. Sunlight poured through the window, settling on the countertop and turning the remnants of last night's dishes into small glowing shapes. He stood with his back to me, shoulders squared, hands gripping the counter as though bracing himself against an invisible pressure. When he turned, his face rearranged into a pleasant neutrality, the kind meant to reassure without offering anything real. I asked if he'd slept well. He gave a short answer and followed it with a joke that didn't land. His eyes slipped away from mine as they had been doing more often lately. There was a slight hesitation, a flicker of calculation in the moment before he looked back up. It was quick practiced, nearly invisible, but the shard of mirror had shown me earlier how subtle distortions mattered. I noticed too the faint scent on his jacket as he hung it on the chair. Not ours. Not familiar. Something floral but understated a presence that didn't belong in our home. I didn't comment. I let silence trace its own shape through the air. Silence, I had learned, made people reveal themselves if you left enough space for the truth to grow restless. He filled the quiet with observations about the weather, with a question about whether I'd seen his missing cufflink, with a gentle but oddly misplaced comment about how I seemed distracted lately. The remark floated between us, coded in concern, but carrying a different intention entirely. I kept my breathing steady. The morning held a strange stillness, a sense that something fragile had shifted without making a sound. As Daniel reached for a glass from the cabinet, his hand paused halfway, hovering as though he'd momentarily forgotten what he intended to do. Then he completed the movement, but the pause had already carved itself into my awareness. His gestures no longer aligned perfectly with the man I knew. The daylight caught his profile, softening the angles of his face, but the softness only highlighted the tension beneath. He asked if I wanted toast. I said yes. He hesitated again, barely a second, but the rhythm broke. Someone had been occupying the spaces where I had once lived. I didn't accuse him. I didn't confront him. Instead, I reached for the mirror shard on the counter, intending only to move it aside, but when my fingers touched its cool edge, the reflection that slid across its surface wavered unnaturally again. My own face split into two uneven halves, one lit, one shadowed. The distorted image felt like an omen whispered too quietly to interpret. Daniel watched me hold the shard, his expression unreadable. He asked why I hadn't thrown it away. I said it reminded me that even small fractures could catch the light. He didn't understand the meaning, but he nodded as though he did. The moment stretched delicate and suspended. In the fragile quiet that followed, I sensed the beginning of a fault line. Beneath his gentle tone, beneath the normalcy, he tried to restore something had already begun to crack. And as he turned back to the counter, the glass shard trembled faintly in my hand, catching a new line of light that didn't belong to morning alone. Something was shifting, and he didn't realize how clearly I could see it. The morning Daniel left earlier than usual unfolded with the kind of quiet that makes every sound feel deliberate. And though the house was still dim when I stepped into the hallway, I immediately sensed something wrong in the air, as if the walls themselves held a breath they weren't supposed to. I reached for the door to check whether he had actually left yet, and the moment my fingers touched the metal, a chill ran up my arm so sharply it startled me. The cold doorknob felt as though someone had gripped it just seconds before I arrived, yet Daniel had told me minutes earlier he was still upstairs getting ready. I stood there, hand resting against the unnatural coldness, letting the inconsistency settle in my mind. A small detail easily dismissed, but small details were what had kept me alive emotionally during the years when truth came in fragments instead of whole sentences. When I walked into the kitchen, a faint trace of his cologne lingered, but mixed with it was something else, an unfamiliar scent, softer and unsettlingly out of place. The window reflected a slivered version of the room, and my own shape wavered within it, as if the light was unsure how firmly it wanted to hold me. I tried to ignore the unease and reached for the kettle when my phone buzzed on the counter with a notification I didn't expect, a cloud backup alert showing recent deleted items restored. Confused, I opened it, and there in the recently recovered folder sat a screenshot I had never taken. The image was crisp, almost too intentional a message thread. Daniel's name at the top, followed by a line marked with the reference ref LX14 and a timestamp of 0738. But at 7:38, he had been standing in the kitchen with me talking casually about needing to leave by 8. The message in the screenshot didn't belong to that moment. It didn't belong to anything he had mentioned. And the fact that it lived in the deleted folder meant he hadn't wanted anyone to see it, including me. I stared at the numbers, the timestamp burning itself into my awareness, like a thin line of light cutting across dark porcelain. The content of the message wasn't visible, only the identifier and the time, but the absence of text somehow made the screenshot even more accusing, as though the missing words had more weight than anything he might have actually typed. Evidence doesn't always present itself with clarity. Sometimes it arrives in fragments, daring you to assemble the truth from the edges. I replayed the morning in my mind, how he'd paused at the doorway before saying goodbye, how his fingers fumbled slightly with the coffee mug, how his eyes had drifted toward the hall as if tracking something unseen. Now, with the cold doorknob and this screenshot in front of me, the pieces no longer felt scattered. They aligned, pointing in a direction I'd been trying not to look. I locked the phone and set it on the counter, though my hand lingered atop it as though afraid the truth might escape if I let go. When I walked back to the hallway, the doorknob still held its unnatural cold, as though echoing the moment he'd touched it. I imagined him standing there checking the time, perhaps sending or receiving the message that later became the screenshot ref LX14 before deleting it. The house, normally a space of predictable rhythms, now pulsed with quiet contradictions, each one widening the distance between what he said and what he did. I moved through the living room, noticing the faint depression in the cushion where he had sat earlier, the angle of the blinds he had adjusted, the near-empty coffee mug on the table, all ordinary things, yet suddenly they felt staged, placed too perfectly by someone performing normalcy rather than living it. A car passed outside, scattering light across the window pane, and for a brief second the reflection on the glass fractured into different angles of me, none of them quite aligned. I steadied myself, breathing slowly as I replayed the timestamp again in my thoughts. 0738. Not a random number, not a mistake. A detail anchored firmly in a timeline he had contradicted without even realizing it. And contradictions, I knew, were the quiet beginnings of truth. I opened the screenshot one more time. The identifier LX14 felt clinical coded, like something meant to hide a real meaning beneath a neat reference. Daniel didn't work with anything labeled like that. He didn't use internal codes. And the style of the message didn't match how he normally communicated. This wasn't a casual text. This wasn't something you deleted out of embarrassment or habit. This was something meant to stay hidden. My pulse thudded once, heavy and decisive. I had seen enough inconsistencies to know when coincidence had stepped aside for intention. Yet I didn't call him. I didn't confront him. Confrontation gives people a chance to build better lies. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate breath, reached for my notebook, and wrote down the timestamp, the reference code, and the exact time he'd told me he planned to leave. I wrote about the cold doorknob, the scent on his jacket, the flicker of hesitation in his voice when he'd mentioned his day. I wrote it all not because I wanted proof yet, but because I knew I would. As I placed the notebook inside my drawer, the mirror on the wall caught a faint glimmer of light, bending it into a thin, fractured line across the floor. It felt like a quiet warning, a reminder that reflections never lie, even when people do. I turned away before I could lose nerve, but the weight of the screenshot pressed itself into my thoughts like a watermark. Something had begun, and whether Daniel realized it or not, the truth had already entered the room. And as I stepped back toward the kitchen, the phone buzzed again, this time with a message I wasn't supposed to see. The cafe was already half full when Daniel and I arrived, the kind of crowded morning that swallowed conversations into a soft hum of clinking cups, low voices, and the occasional burst of laughter from a table too awake for the hour. The windows were wide-framed by pale curtains, letting in a wash of bright light that sharpened the edges of every object in the room, including the glass ashtray resting near the corner of our table. Its surface caught the sunlight and fractured it into thin, cold streaks that stretched across the wooden top like quiet warnings. Lindsay joined us only a few minutes later. Her heels tapping lightly against the tile, her expression smooth and unreadable. She kissed Daniel on the cheek, nodded at me with a politeness that hovered just shy of sincerity, and slid into the seat beside him instead of across from him. That detail alone said more than any greeting could have. I sat across from them, watching how Daniel leaned slightly toward her, how she angled her body to form a subtle barrier that made me feel like the guest rather than the wife. The server brought our drinks, placing mine gently near the ashtray, and the moment the glass touched the table, its reflection shimmered faintly, splitting into two overlapping shapes. I blinked, unsure whether the distortion came from the light or my own exhausted perception. Daniel began talking about work, painting himself as the overburdened professional whose efforts went unnoticed, a script he had perfected over the years. Lindsay chimed in with sympathetic nods, her voice warm enough to seem caring, but cool enough to reveal distance. I listened, though the words didn't matter. What mattered was the performance. The careful way Daniel modulated his tone to appear thoughtful and patient, as though he were the one pulling extra weight while I drifted through life unaware. I let him speak, taking small sips from my cup, feeling the heat rise slowly through my hands. It was when the server passed behind our table that the shift happened. Daniel lowered his voice, leaning slightly closer to Lindsay, and murmured something with a softness I knew too well, a tone he reserved for private criticisms, disguised as gentle insights. Some people, he said, just don't understand how much they complicate things for everyone else. Lindsay's quiet laugh followed a soft exhale through her nose, amused and complicit. I felt the words before I processed them, their shape slicing neatly into the space between my ribs. The witness, a middle-aged man seated at the adjacent high-top table, paused mid-stir of his coffee, his eyes lifting toward Daniel with a faint tightening around them. He had heard the line clearly. So had I. Evidence doesn't always require an object. Sometimes it arrives through the simple act of another person turning their head. The man's gaze flicked from Daniel to me, holding a brief note of sympathy or curiosity before he looked away, choosing discretion, but unable to unhear the moment. Evidence number 2 settled into place without effort, clean and irrefutable. Lindsay glanced at the witness, realized he had heard, and quickly shifted her posture to block the line of sight between him and Daniel. Her smile grew tighter, carefully curated, but her fingers drummed once on the table, an unconscious tick of unease. Daniel didn't notice. He rarely noticed anything outside the boundaries of his own narrative. Instead, he continued speaking, unaware that the room had changed temperature around him. He mentioned my supposed forgetfulness with a sigh so delicate it could have passed for patience. He framed my silence as emotional withdrawal rather than self-preservation. He painted himself the victim of some subtle erosion he implied I was causing. Each remark was crafted with harmless wording, but delivered with that familiar undercurrent of quiet cruelty. and every word now spoken in public left a trace that couldn't be unwound. I felt heat climb into my palms again, not from the coffee this time, but from an anger so contained it had become cold at the center, a steady flame that didn't flicker. The glass ashtray caught another glint of light reflecting a distorted version of Daniel's face stretched warped, revealing something sharper beneath the calm expression he wore. The motif, faint and unintentional, appeared in the way the reflection trembled across the ashtray's curved surface before settling into stillness. I wondered how he would look if he noticed the reflection himself, whether he would recognize the fracture or dismiss it as an illusion. My silence made him bolder. He leaned back, crossed one leg over the other, and let his voice drift into another carefully worded remark about maintaining balance in relationships. Lindsay nodded again. And then, perhaps forgetting the witness's proximity or convinced he was speaking quietly enough, Daniel added in a slightly hushed tone, "It's getting exhausting, you know, trying to carry someone who won't carry herself." I felt the words more as vibration than sound settling in the center of my chest with a muted thud. The witness froze again, spoon suspended midair. His gaze met mine, and this time there was no mistaking the recognition he understood that Daniel's words weren't casual. They were intentional. They were meant to degrade. Whether the witness pitied me or simply cataloged what he heard didn't matter. He had become part of the story Daniel couldn't control. A small mini twist unfolded when Lindsay's phone buzzed on the table, and she reacted too quickly, silencing it before Daniel could see the screen. Her eyes darted toward me, not in challenge but in warning, as if she feared I might say something he wasn't ready to hear. That reaction told me more than anything Daniel had said. Something was happening between them. Not romantic necessarily, but coordinated, aligned, protective in a way siblings shouldn't need to be unless something was deeply wrong. I took another sip of my drink and let the silence return, knowing Daniel would interpret it as compliance. He always had, but silence has shape, and mine was becoming sharper, clearer, no longer the surrender he thought it was. The witness rose from his seat, placing a few bills on his table before leaving. As he walked past me, he slowed just enough to glance at me once more, not pitying, not intrusive, simply acknowledging what he had heard. And that was enough. When he left, the air shifted again. The reflection in the ashtray stilled into a perfect arc of light. And as Daniel lifted his cup preparing another soft, cutting remark, I realized I wouldn't be absorbing his words much longer. I found the silver key by accident, though the moment my fingers brushed against it inside Daniel's jacket pocket, the cool metal felt too deliberate to belong to coincidence. It was small, unmarked, and heavier than it should have been for something so simple like it carried a weight beyond its physical size. I turned it over slowly, the polished surface catching a thin line of afternoon light that bent across my palm in a distorted shimmer. Daniel had left the jacket draped over the dining chair, careless or confident, I couldn't tell which, but the presence of the key felt intentional, as if it had been waiting for me. My pulse quickened not in fear, but in the quiet, steady awareness that something new had entered the puzzle I had been stitching together. I placed the key on the table, watching its reflection waver faintly on the glossy surface, before stabilizing the distortion, reminding me of the way truth often trembled before settling. The house was silent, except for the steady hum of the refrigerator, a sound that somehow made the space feel more empty than usual. Daniel wasn't home yet, though he had texted earlier saying he'd be back soon. His messages had grown shorter lately, more efficient, less human. I opened my laptop not to snoop, but because I needed clarity, and clarity lived in patterns, timestamps, and digital traces people never intended to leave behind. The home security camera footage loaded with its usual quiet hum, the familiar timeline stretching across the screen like a spine. I scrolled to the night before, focusing on the hour Daniel claimed he returned, 9 to 14 p.m. He had been adamant about the time almost too precise, which already made me suspicious. The footage played. At 9:06 p.m., the door opened. Daniel entered, shoulders hunched, slightly movements quick and efficient like he wanted to occupy as little space as possible. I checked the timestamp again. 9:06. Then rewound. Played it again. 9:06. But the event log at the bottom linked to the smart lock listed the entry at 9:14. A mismatch. A timestamp glitch, small but undeniable. Evidence number 3. I leaned closer to the screen, watching the light shift across his face as he stepped inside. A faint reflection off the hallway mirror caught the side of his expression, splitting it for just a breath into two uneven halves, one relaxed, the other tense. That flicker of distortion felt more honest than any explanation he might later offer. Daniel didn't notice the camera when he entered. He rarely paid attention to details he believed wouldn't reveal him. He set his bag down, checked his phone, and rubbed the bridge of his nose the way he always did when he'd been somewhere he didn't want traced back. The glitch wasn't an accident. Someone had altered the entry time or attempted to either the device misread the sync or Daniel had tinkered with something he didn't fully understand. I watched the footage again, slow this time, letting each movement settle into place. The truth lived in pauses, not motions. In the small spaces people forgot to control. At 9:06 he entered. At 9:14 he pretended he did. That gap held more weight than he realized. As I sat back absorbing the implications, the silver key caught a fresh streak of light spinning its reflection across the table, like a compass turning towards something hidden. I wondered what it unlocked. A mailbox. A locker. A drawer I'd never seen. The key didn't belong to our home. I knew every lock intimately. My mind drifted back to the scent on his jacket, to the overheard remark in the cafe, to Lindsay's too-quick movement when her phone buzzed. The pieces didn't yet form a full picture, but they no longer floated separately. They were gathering, cohering, finding direction. A part of me wanted to call him immediately, thrust the evidence into conversation, demand a straight line from a man who lived in curves. But another part, the stronger part, knew better. Confrontation is a gift you give too early when you want the other person to panic. I didn't want Daniel panicking. Not yet. I wanted him predictable. Predictability reveals more than fear ever will. I picked up the silver key again, running my thumb along its smooth edge. The reflection on its surface trembled faintly before stabilizing into a thin, steady line mirroring the calm that had begun settling inside me. This wasn't the panic of someone discovering betrayal. This was the clarity of someone tracking it. My phone buzzed a message from Mara, checking whether I was free to talk later. She had noticed things at work, pieces of conversation that didn't match the stories Daniel gave me. Her concern felt real. I typed a quick yes, feeling gratitude for her presence woven into the quiet corners of my life. Then another message arrived, this one from Daniel running late. Be home soon. No punctuation. No warmth. No detail. A message shaped like a door half closing. I slipped the silver key into my pocket just as the front door handle rattled faintly, not opening, just testing the latch from the outside, as though someone checked whether they could enter quietly. The metal tremor echoed through the woods, subtle but unmistakable. The doorknob warmed slowly under the pressure, but my pulse stayed cold, steady, ready. Something or someone lingered on the other side for a moment, a presence too controlled to be accidental. Then footsteps backed away. As silence settled again, the key pressed lightly against my leg, reminding me that not all locks are meant to be opened immediately. And when Daniel finally walked in minutes later, he didn't realize that the truth had slipped through the door before he ever touched it. The hallway bulb had been flickering for days, a weak pulse of light that twitched unpredictably. But on the night Daniel came home, its trembling glow felt different, as though it were reacting to something carried in on his breath rather than just faulty wiring. I stood midway down the hall, half-shadowed, listening as the front door clicked open and his footsteps trailed inside with an uneven rhythm that didn't match the confident cadence he usually wore like a second skin. He paused near the coat rack, and for a moment the bulb flickered hard enough to split his silhouette into two uneven shapes stretching across the floor. When he stepped into view, the stuttering light painted sharp edges across his face, revealing tension in the tight set of his jaw. He said my name quietly, almost too casually, and the moment the bulb fluttered again, something in his expression changed the slightest eye flick, a reflexive tightening that contradicted the calm he tried to project. I noticed even if he hoped I wouldn't. The fractured reflection sharpens as the light flickers. The motif echo settled into the air with a clarity that made the scene feel preordained. I asked how his evening had gone, keeping my tone warm enough to pass for softness, but even enough that he couldn't measure anything beneath it. He answered quickly, too quickly, a rehearsed line about a late meeting. Nothing unusual, nothing I should question. His voice used the same gentle cadence he relied on when trying to control a narrative. But when I stepped closer, the bulb buzzed faintly overhead and he froze. Not visibly, not dramatically. Just a microscopic stillness inside his breath that told me the truth. The story didn't fit. Even his silence sounded wrong. Stretched thin and unnatural, as though he were holding back not just words but entire pieces of the night. Evidence number 4 settled into place, as naturally as air filling a room, his behavioral contradiction, the shifting tone, the glance away, the held breath. He moved past me toward the kitchen, and for a moment the flickering bulb caught the back of his head, fracturing his shadow into shards along the wall. I followed slowly, watching how the pieces of him didn't line up the way they used to. In the kitchen, he gripped the counter with both hands, knuckles pale beneath the skin. A bowl sat on the counter from the previous night, and the faint reflection in its glass surface trembled each time the bulb blinked. He seemed unaware of how exposed he looked under the unstable light. He straightened, forced a smile that appeared too quickly, and asked about my day. The smile vanished as soon as the bulb dimmed, revealing an expression he hadn't meant to show, a tense, searching look that darted around the room as if checking for inconsistencies. I told him my day had been quiet. He nodded, though his eyes didn't settle on mine. Instead, they tracked the bulb's flicker like he expected it to reveal something. I stood close enough to see the way his breathing shifted shallow, then deep, then shallow again. A rhythm that didn't belong to calmness, but to someone managing a reaction. He asked if I had eaten dinner. I asked if he had. He hesitated. That hesitation, small, almost invisible, was enough to widen the crack already running through his story. I stepped to the sink, rinsed a glass, and pretended not to notice that he watched me with the cautious intensity of someone trying to anticipate the next question. His hands fidgeted on the countertop, tapping lightly, a nervous gesture he rarely displayed unless something was very wrong. The bulb flickered again harder this time, sending a fractured beam across his reflection in the window. For a moment, I saw two versions of him, the composed facade and the truth beneath it trembling and sharp-edged. I asked where his meeting had been. He answered with a location he had used before a safe, familiar lie, but the timing didn't match what I'd seen on his schedule earlier. His eyes slipped sideways at the exact moment the bulb flashed bright, and the contradiction settled cleanly into the room. I didn't correct him. I didn't reveal what I knew. I simply nodded, watching the way his shoulders eased, as though he believed the lie had passed unnoticed. People reveal their truest selves in the moments they think they've gotten away with something. He poured himself a drink. His hand shook slightly. The bulb flickered again. I stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the shape of my presence, and he stiffened, realizing too late that I had been watching everything he hadn't meant to show. A brittle silence stretched between us. Not comfortable. Not familiar. A silence made of sharp edges. Then, without warning, he reached out and switched off the flickering bulb, plunging the hallway into a softer, safer dimness. But he didn't realize that in turning off the light, he had removed the only thing masking the tremor in his voice when he finally muttered, "You always look at me like you're waiting for something." I held his gaze, quiet, even, letting him fill the silence with whatever truth he didn't intend to reveal. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then shut it again, another contradiction. Another piece of evidence in a night that had begun unraveling from the moment he walked inside. I asked gently, "Is there something you want to tell me?" The question landed like a tremor in the room. He almost answered. I saw it in the way his chest expanded, ready to release a confession or a lie. But then he stopped. Shut down. Retreated. "No," he said too softly. "Too late." The fractured reflection lingered along the window pane behind him, catching the outline of his expression as he turned away. Something inside that reflection looked cornered. And still he tried to pretend he was steady. He didn't notice I stepped back, just in time to see the look he wore when he thought I wasn't watching fear, not guilt, and fear always means there's more hidden beyond the lie. Mara drove the two of us back to the cafe on a gray, windless afternoon, the kind of day where the sky felt too heavy to hold itself up. And as we stepped inside, the familiar scent of espresso and old wood wrapped around us like an echo of the moment everything had first begun to tilt. Calvin, the manager, recognized me instantly. His expression softened with a mixture of caution and something that felt like concern, a quiet acknowledgement of the scene he had witnessed only days before. I approached the counter slowly, my eyes drifting to the small cluster of items left beside the register, lost gloves, a forgotten pen, and beneath them a thin receipt slip curled slightly at the edges. Its faint ink caught the window light, shimmering with the same fragile tension that had been tracing itself across my life. Calvin gestured for us to follow him into the back, where the hum of the refrigerator filled the room with a low, steady vibration. He spoke carefully, as though navigating a tightrope between neutrality and empathy, explaining that he couldn't give away everything, but could show me something that might help clarify timelines. He opened a small drawer and pulled out the very receipt slip I had seen on the counter, placing it gently into my hand. The printed text was simple. 2 drinks purchased at 6:52 p.m., the same evening Daniel had insisted he was eating alone after work. The timestamp settled into my awareness like a stone dropped into still water. But Calvin wasn't finished. He turned to the computer against the wall, typed in a password with practice speed, and brought up a series of CCTV stills from the night in question. The images were grainy, the camera struggling against low light, but the shape in the frame was unmistakably Daniel, his posture, his jacket, the way he held his shoulders slightly forward when speaking intently. He sat at the cafe table leaning toward someone just out of frame, his expression tense, deliberate, intimate, in a way that didn't match anything he had described to me. He had not been alone. That was evidence number 5, clear enough to tilt the entire narrative he had been building, even if the image itself remained blurred. Mara inhaled sharply. I didn't. I simply stared at the still, letting the truth slide into place without resistance. The reflection off the computer screen splintered faintly, bending the light around the image, giving it an almost noir theatricality that made the moment feel staged by something larger than us. Calvin looked between us, his eyes apologetic. I can't give you the footage, he said softly, but I can confirm the time. And that he wasn't alone. Authority doesn't always arrive in uniform. Sometimes it wears an apron and speaks gently while holding truths others tried to bury. I thanked him, though the words felt inadequate. As we stepped back into the cafe, Mara's hand brushed my arm, grounding me. She whispered that she had overheard Lindsay defending Daniel at work again, almost aggressively, as though preparing a narrative to keep him insulated. The details slid into my thoughts with a cold clarity. Lindsay wasn't just covering for him. She was part of something larger, something coordinated, orchestrated under the guise of familial concern. I approached the table where we had sat days earlier, the same table where the witness overheard Daniel's cutting remark, and I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint scorch mark on the wood, barely visible, shaped like a thin crescent. A tiny detail, insignificant to anyone else, but it made me imagine Daniel sitting there with someone leaning forward, lowering his voice, performing the same cruelty or manipulation he had used on me. My reflection shimmered faintly in the polished metal napkin holder, splitting into 2 uneven bands of light, before realigning another quiet peripheral reminder that truth never arrives cleanly. It arrives fractured and sharp, then demands to be assembled. Mara asked whether I was okay, and I surprised myself by nodding. Not because the revelation didn't hurt, but because hurt had stopped being unfamiliar. There was a moment, small and almost tender, where I placed the receipt slip flat on the table and watched the ink darken slightly under the weight of my finger. That slip of paper, wrinkled and thin, held a timeline Daniel could no longer shape. Truth, even when blurry, doesn't bend. Not for long. As we walked back toward the exit, the cafe's front door opened and a cold breeze swept through the room, tugging at the receipt slip still in my hand. I tightened my grip instinctively, feeling its edge press lightly into my palm, a sensation sharp enough to ground me in the present. Calvin called after us, his voice soft but steady, telling me that if anything else appeared on the cameras, he'd let me know discreetly. The offer wasn't just kindness, it was an acknowledgement that what I sought was no longer simple suspicion, but something approaching defense protection even. Outside, the air felt colder than it should have. Clouds gathered low, pressing their weight across the horizon, threatening rain. Mara asked what I planned to do next. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked down at the receipt slip again, feeling the residue of Daniel's lie, imprinted in the timestamp in the ink, in the still image burned into my mind. I didn't need access to the full footage to know the truth. I already had it. What mattered now was what I would do with it. The path ahead felt clearer than it had in days, though clarity didn't make it easier. It just made it inevitable. Mara squeezed my hand gently before heading to her car, telling me she'd call later. I stood alone on the sidewalk, the receipt slip held loosely between my fingers, the sky darkening above. A car passed, and in its window I caught a brief, wavering reflection of myself, steady expression, unreadable, the fractured lines of uncertainty beginning to straighten. And then my phone buzzed with a notification. It was Daniel. But the message wasn't sent to me alone. Lindsay was copied in, and the subject line read, "We need to align our story." The living room felt heavier than usual that night, as though the walls were waiting for something to be said before they allowed the air to move again. And when I switched on the dim lamp beside the couch, its muted glow barely pushed back the shadows. The bulb hummed faintly, a quiet vibration that softened the edges of the room into something resembling a stage set, and I realized how appropriate that felt. Daniel had been performing for weeks, but tonight the performance might finally collapse. I sat at the coffee table with the stack of mail I had been avoiding, each envelope a potential fragment of truth or another layer of scripted lies. When I reached the thin, crisp slip of paper folded neatly inside a generic bank envelope, I almost didn't open it. But something inside me, a steadiness that had been building through every contradiction, every fractured reflection, every silence that cut sharper than words, told me I needed to. The slip unfolded easily, its printed numbers glowing faintly under the dim lamp's weak light. And there it was, a transfer I hadn't authorized, one that didn't match any joint account activity, one that carried a destination number ending in 5121. Evidence number 6. The amount wasn't enormous, but it was deliberate, precise, a number chosen to avoid drawing attention. Daniel had made the transfer 3 days earlier at a time he claimed he had been stuck in traffic. A timeline that didn't surprise me anymore. My pulse didn't spike. Instead, something inside me settled, as if the truth had finally decided to step into full view. I traced the account ending 5121 with my thumb feeling the faint ridge of the inked digits, as though touching them would confirm something intangible. A financial slip this clean, this intentional, wasn't casual. It wasn't a mistake. It was a breadcrumb, one he hadn't meant to leave behind. The dim lamp flickered once, faintly causing its glow to stretch across the slip in a thin, trembling beam. The reflection bent slightly, distorting the printed line, echoing the fractured images that had followed me through the past week. This was my major reversal, not because the evidence shocked me, but because it aligned the entire landscape into something coherent. All the inconsistencies, the timestamp glitch, the overheard cruelty, the CCTV, still the cold doorknob, they weren't separate cracks. They were the map. Daniel entered the house moments later. His footsteps soft, hesitant, as though he sensed, before seeing me, that the evening would not unfold on his terms. He paused at the threshold of the living room when he saw me, sitting in the dim light, the bank slip resting on my fingers like a verdict I hadn't spoken yet. His face tried to settle into neutrality but failed. Something flickered behind his eyes, a swallow of unease he couldn't mask quickly enough. "You're up late," he said, his voice softer than usual, lacking the casual cruelty he'd carried at the cafe, lacking even the confident warmth he wielded when fabricating explanations. I gestured for him to sit. He didn't. He hovered near the doorway as if sitting would commit him to a version of truth he wasn't prepared to give. The dim lamp cast a half shadow across his face, splitting it into 2 uneven halves, one calm, one tense, and the sight of it filled me with a strange sense of déjà vu. Every reflection of him the past week had been fractured. Tonight the fracture wasn't in the light. It was in him. I held up the bank slip. "What is this?" He blinked. A beat too long. Then he exhaled slowly, the sound too measured, too controlled. "You shouldn't go through my mail," he said, and the reprimand would have stung once long ago, but tonight it landed flat, irrelevant. "It was in the joint pile," I replied. "And it's from an account I didn't know existed." His jaw tightened. His eyes flicked not away but toward the dark corner of the room, as if hoping the shadows might offer him an excuse. "It's nothing," he said, but the word quivered barely perceptible, a tremor of guilt or fear or both. "Just a transfer between accounts I use for work." But Daniel didn't have work accounts outside the ones I already knew, the ones tied to his salary and expenses, and I saw it the instant he realized he had given the wrong lie. A small mistake, but one that widened the gap between us into something irreversible. "Work accounts," I repeated quietly, letting the words trace their own outline around him. The lamp hummed again, its dim glow catching on the bank slip and bending into a thin beam that stretched across his chest like a narrow accusatory line. He stepped back slightly as if the light itself pressed against him. His voice thinned. "I didn't want to worry you." That sentence, those 6 words, were the moment everything aligned. Not because the excuse was weak, but because it came from the same script he used whenever he wanted to hide something under the veneer of concern. I stared at him not with anger, but with clarity. People reveal themselves most when they believe they can still convince you. Daniel was trying to convince me of something even he didn't believe. "You made a transfer," I said slowly, "from an account I didn't know about to another account I also didn't know about. During a time you told me you were sitting in traffic." He opened his mouth, searching for a lie that could hold the weight of what he had done. Nothing came. He stood there suspended in the dim glow, the truth pushing through the cracks of his performance. Then a mini twist, he whispered. "You weren't supposed to see that slip. Lindsay was going to explain it to you." Lindsay. Always Lindsay. Her name entered the room like an unwelcome gust of cold air. I inhaled slowly, letting the realization settle. She wasn't only defending him. She was part of the infrastructure of the lie. He stepped closer, hands half raised as though trying to shape the air into something believable. "Emily, it isn't what you think, but it was exactly what I thought. Or worse." The dim lamp flickered again, its glow stretching across the bank slip until the numbers blurred into a smear of shadow and light. And as Daniel waited for my response, his breath shallow, his posture defensive, I felt something shift inside me, quiet but decisive. Because now that the financial trail had surfaced, I finally knew exactly where to look next. The house felt unnervingly quiet the next evening, the kind of silence that presses against your ribs until breathing becomes something you have to think about. And as I sorted through the pile of mail on the table, a torn envelope slipped loose from between 2 utility bills, its ripped edge curling upward like a warning. I didn't recognize the handwriting, but the jagged tear told me Daniel had opened it in haste or anger or secrecy, none of which surprised me anymore. I set it aside, intending to return to it, but my attention pulled toward my laptop the moment a notification flashed across the screen, an auto-archive alert from Daniel's shared cloud folder. He had forgotten to restrict syncing on one of his devices. His mistake, not mine. I clicked the folder and there it was. Evidence number 7, an internal memo draft addressed not to his colleagues but to Lindsay, written 2 nights ago, its subject line, "A sterile household logistics upcoming adjustments." The memo wasn't long, but each line carved through me with a slow, blistering precision. He outlined changes he intended to make, financial adjustments, boundaries, recommendations for dividing responsibilities, phrased as if discussing a restructuring plan rather than a marriage. He wrote about me in detached terms, describing my increasing instability, my inconsistencies, my emotional unpredictability that may require intervention. Intervention? As if I were the one bending timelines, hiding evidence, transferring money to secret accounts. My breath stayed steady, though. I refused to let him script my reaction into the narrative he was building. The memo continued, suggesting that Lindsay help him frame the upcoming discussion in a constructive way, a phrase that made my pulse throb once, not from anger, but from a chilling clarity. He had been planning to confront me. Not with honesty, but with a strategy. A weapon disguised as reason. He ended the memo with a line that hollowed the room. Once she accepts the new terms, things should stabilize. Stabilize. As if I were a volatile system needing calibration. I closed the laptop slowly, the dim light from the overhead fixtures reflecting faintly on its surface, bending into a warped sliver of brightness that trembled before smoothing a quiet echo of all the fractured reflections that had followed me. The torn envelope on the table caught my eye again, its shredded edge still raised like it wanted to speak. I picked it up and tilted it under the light, noticing a faint indentation in the paper. Something had been folded inside, removed quickly. Whatever message it once held, Daniel had taken great care to hide it. My hand tightened slightly, the envelope's torn flap brushing my skin like a reminder that while the financial trail had exposed one truth, there were still others buried beneath his careful choreography. The doorknob clicked faintly in the hallway, just a shift in temperature, I told myself, but the sound carried an oddly familiar weight, the same subtle metal tremor that had preceded more than one lie. I inhaled slowly, letting the air settle in my chest, before walking to the desk where I had placed the silver key from days earlier. Its surface now held a faint smudge, the trace of my thumb from hours of unconscious handling. I realized something then, something sharp and decisive. Daniel had always assumed I would react blindly, emotionally, desperately. He had built an entire narrative on that assumption. He had never considered the possibility that I might choose my moment instead of collapsing into his. I returned to the laptop, reopening the memo. This time I read the lines with detachment, like analyzing a marketing campaign from a competitor, cold, methodical, dissecting tone and intent. Every sentence told me not just what Daniel believed, but what he feared that I might gather enough truth to break free of the story he wanted me trapped in. The lamp above the table flickered slightly. Not a dramatic tremor. Just a momentary shift in brightness that cast two faint shadows of my hands on the desk. The motif drifted through the room again, light-bending truth, splitting into pieces before realigning. I opened the email header details, scanning metadata the way I might analyze client behavior patterns. And there it was, a draft saved multiple times in the same hour he claimed to be meeting a difficult client. He hadn't been meeting anyone professionally. He had been crafting a narrative for my downfall. That realization did not break me. It steadied me. Because now the path forward wasn't murky. It was linear. Clean. I stood holding the torn envelope in one hand and the memo open on the screen, and I felt the full weight of the forced decision settling onto me, not an emotional ultimatum, but a strategic turning point. I could confront him immediately, demand answers, force him into the open before he could prepare. Or I could wait. Choose the moment when his assumptions about me would work against him. The wiser move was clear. Predictability is a weapon when you use someone else's. A mini twist surfaced as I tapped the laptop trackpad. A second document appeared in the auto-sync queue, an unsent email draft addressed not to Lindsay, but to Mara. My breath tightened. The email contained half-written concerns about me, phrased as if seeking support from a neutral third party. He was preparing to use my friend as a witness in the story he was shaping. He planned to turn her into evidence against me. The lamp dimmed further, its glow softening the edges of the room into something quieter, more deliberate. The torn envelope fluttered slightly between my fingers as though exhaling. I understood then that I could no longer wait for Daniel to reveal himself. He was already rewriting me into someone unrecognizable. It was time to reclaim the narrative. I closed the memo file and placed the envelope beside the laptop, the torn flap pointing toward the hallway where Daniel's footsteps would soon sound again. And as the house settled back into its oppressive quiet, another notification blinked onto the screen, an automated reminder of the cafe's camera updates. The timing was too perfect to ignore, and I realized then that tomorrow's confrontation would not happen in private. The cafe looked strangely brighter that morning, as if the sunlight had been waiting specifically for this moment to pour itself sharply through the windows, illuminating every table, every reflection, every person who had unknowingly taken a seat in the audience of a truth Daniel had spent weeks trying to bury. I arrived first, choosing the same table where the witness had overheard his cruelty, placing my phone face down beside a napkin and letting my gaze drift across the polished surface where faint distortions of light shimmered like restless ghosts. A moment later, Daniel walked in with a tension he couldn't disguise, glancing around too quickly. Shoulders slightly hunched, a man already aware he had lost control of the narrative. Behind him, the cafe door swung shut, sending a ripple of movement through the room. As he approached, I noticed the subtle way he adjusted his sleeve, revealing the edge of his watch. When he sat down, a thin line of sunlight struck the metal, creating the required wristwatch glint, a sharp flare that cut across the table like a blade of quiet truth. He greeted me with a strained warmth that collapsed almost immediately when he saw my expression. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but stretched thin. "Yes," I answered, my tone steady. "We do." I reached into my bag not for any dramatic flourish, but because the moment demanded clarity, not spectacle. Before I could speak, another figure approached Calvin, the cafe manager, holding a folded piece of paper with a careful, almost solemn posture. Authority enters quietly, but unmistakably. "Ms. Carter," he said gently, "I think this belongs to you." The system refreshed overnight. It corrected the timestamp. He placed the folded paper on the table between Daniel and me. The sound was small but final, like the click of a lock turning. Daniel stiffened. He didn't look at the receipt. He watched me instead, searching my face for the angle of my next move. But the truth didn't belong to him anymore. I unfolded the paper. The timestamp glowed clean and irrefutable. 6:52 p.m. The exact moment 2 drinks had been purchased. The exact moment Daniel said he had been alone. Evidence number 8. The final truth drop. Daniel inhaled sharply, the smallest flick of panic crossing his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, he looked genuinely unprepared. "Emily," he whispered, "let me explain." But I cut him off not with words, but with the truth I had been holding since part 3. The truth that had sat quietly in the background, waiting for the correct window to step forward. "I saw you," I said softly. "The night you rehearsed the lines you planned to use on me." His face drained. He hadn't expected that. This was the hidden truth. Weeks earlier, he had stood in the hallway believing himself alone, practicing statements about my emotional instability, preparing the narrative he would later try to execute through memos, financial trails, and Lindsay's support. I watched him through the reflection in the glass cabinet, his face split between sincerity and calculation. I never confronted him because I needed the rest of the truth first, and now it was all here. The cafe had fallen quieter. People sensed tension the way animals sense storms. Daniel swallowed, his voice thinning. You misunderstood what you saw. But I wasn't the one misunderstanding anything. I slid the receipt across the table, letting the sunlight catch the wristwatch glint again, anchoring the moment in noir clarity. You lied about where you were. You lied about who you were with. And you manipulated the narrative to make me question myself. He opened his mouth, but Calvin stepped subtly closer, not interfering, not taking sides, but existing as living proof that Daniel's lies could not exist in isolation anymore. Sir Calvin said gently, I was here that night. You weren't alone. A ripple passed through Daniel's expression, fear, anger, surrender, calculation, each one flickering like the bulb that had exposed him in part 6. His hands trembled slightly on the table, and for the first time he didn't try to hide it. It wasn't what you think he said, voice cracking. I wasn't. But the next words tangled. The line he wanted to deliver couldn't steady itself. His lies had run out of structure. The motif whispered through the scene, slipping into the shimmer on the tabletop, fractured reflections sharpening into truth. He closed his eyes briefly, exhaling defeat. It was Lindsay's idea, he admitted. The memos, the adjustments, the conversation we planned, a confession too small, too late, and the transfers I asked. He didn't answer quickly. That hesitation told its own story. Finally, he whispered, they were to cover things I couldn't explain yet. Not an answer. A stall. A tactic. But I no longer played inside his boundaries. Daniel, I said calmly, this is the moment you stop deciding which version of me the world gets to see. His eyes widened not at my words, but at the realization that I wasn't trembling, wasn't breaking, wasn't bending the way he had counted on. This was my forced decision made real confrontation in daylight truth, exposed silence replaced with clarity. Mara entered the cafe, then unexpected breath, slightly unsteady, and the mini twist struck hard. She had received the same memo draft. Daniel had sent it to her accidentally before deleting it. She held her phone up, displaying the partial text he had meant to weaponize against me. He looked between us, panic rising. His story had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The witness from Part 4 sitting near the corner recognized Daniel instantly and stiffened memory crossing his face. People don't forget cruelty. The room felt brighter still, the wristwatch glint on Daniel's wrist flashing like the final flare before something extinguishes. He whispered, I didn't mean for it to go this far. But intent no longer mattered. Truth did. I stood slowly gathering my things with a calmness that belonged to someone who had already crossed the threshold of uncertainty and stepped firmly into clarity. Daniel reached out slightly as if to stop the moment from leaving him behind. Emily, please, he said. But the moment wasn't his anymore. The air held still, the reflection on the table unmoving. And as I stepped away from the table, sunlight pooling behind me, I realized Daniel wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for the story to remain his. By the time I reached home after the confrontation at the cafe, the sky had shifted into that muted, colorless twilight where everything feels suspended between revelation and aftermath. And the air inside the house tasted strangely sterile, as if it had been scrubbed clean of his lies, but not yet filled with whatever would come next. Daniel arrived 15 minutes later, breath, uneven hair disheveled as though he had run a hand through it repeatedly during the drive, desperately trying to compose a version of himself that could still persuade me. But persuasion no longer had a place here. He stepped inside with the shakiness of a man entering a crime scene where he was both perpetrator and witness, unsure which role he would be forced to inhabit. His phone slipped from his hand as he set his keys down, hitting the hardwood with a sharp crack, the screen splintering instantly into jagged veins of fractured light. The cracked phone lay there like a symbol of everything he had tried to control, finally undeniably broken. I didn't pick it up. I let it remain on the floor, a fitting object for the quiet collapse he had engineered with such precision. Daniel stood in the doorway of the living room, shoulders sagging, eyes darting between the shattered device and my expression. "Emily, please," he managed, but the plea didn't land the way he intended. His words trembled without direction, no longer sharpened by cruelty or wrapped in practiced calm. He was unraveling in real time, exposed by the sunlight that still clung to the edges of my clothes from the cafe. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him. Calamity requires sound. Truth does not. I simply held up the folder in my hand, a collection of the evidence he hadn't known I gathered, each piece arranged neatly to reflect the shape of the man he kept insisting he wasn't. Screenshots, receipts, inconsistencies in his digital footprints, and of course, the corrected timestamp that had stripped the last veneer of plausible innocence from him. He flinched when he saw it, not from the content, but from the knowledge that I had built a narrative of my own, one rooted in facts instead of manipulation. "You don't understand," he insisted, squeezing the back of the chair with fingers that trembled slightly. "I was trying to protect us. To protect you." The absurdity of that statement didn't anger me. It clarified him. He no longer knew the difference between control and care. "You rehearsed a script to undermine me," I said quietly. "You created a financial trail I wasn't supposed to find. You wrote memos about my instability while building an infrastructure of lies beneath my feet. If that's protection, Daniel, then your version of safety is a cage." He opened his mouth closed. It swallowed hard. His eyes glistened with something not remorse, not guilt, but fear. Raw, actual fear. He began to pace, stepping around the cracked phone as if afraid of touching it again. "I was losing control," he admitted in a voice that cracked on the last word. Everything was slipping. Work expectations, the pressure Lindsay said I needed to take steps before things fell apart. Fell apart for whom I asked, genuine curiosity threading through the question. He didn't answer. Not because he didn't know, but because he finally understood the truth he'd been avoiding. Things had only ever been falling apart for him. I had simply stopped cushioning the fall. He sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. The dim overhead light flickered once, a tiny echo of the motif, a final fractured reflection before resolve. And for a moment I saw him not as the architect of my unraveling, but as a man crushed under the weight of his own deceptions. But empathy is not the same as forgiveness. I sat across from him, setting the evidence folder on the table. "I'm not here to scream," I said softly. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to close the gap between what you pretended to be and what you are." He lifted his head, eyes rimmed in red. "Emily, I can fix this." "You can't," I replied gently, "because you never broke me. You only revealed yourself." He stared at me as though hearing his own diagnosis for the first time. And then the mini twist he whispered, "It wasn't just Lindsay." My heartbeat didn't spike, but the air sharpened. "Who else?" He shook his head, tears gathering his voice, caught in the tangled web of consequences he could no longer control. It doesn't matter. It's over. But I had heard enough. Not to chase the new thread, no, that was his responsibility now, but to solidify the truth this had never been about me unraveling. It had always been about him hiding. I stood collecting the few belongings I needed. Daniel rose abruptly, panic flaring. "You're leaving? I'm choosing myself," I corrected. He stepped forward, then stopped as though the cracked phone on the floor formed a barrier he couldn't cross. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked, voice small, unsteady. "You'll figure that out," I said. "But not with me as your alibi." I walked toward the doorway, the air shifting as I passed the house, feeling lighter with each step. At the threshold, I paused and looked back only once, not at Daniel, but at the reflection in the window behind him. It no longer fractured. It held. Solid. True. The beginning of resolution. And as I stepped into the hallway, the wooden floor creaking softly beneath my weight, I realized Daniel wasn't afraid of losing me. He was terrified of facing himself without the story he had built around my silence. Morning light drifts across the room with a softness I barely recognize, settling on the corners of the dresser where the empty frame now stands, its border catching a thin sliver of gold, as though it has been waiting for a new beginning to take shape. I move slowly through the quiet of my new apartment, the air carrying no trace of Daniel's cologne, no tension folded into the shadows, no weight pressing from the walls. Everything feels deliberate here, intentional, chosen. The clock ticks calmly on the kitchen counter, steady and ordinary, and for the first time in weeks, I let the sound fill me, rather than shrink inside it. Today begins without performance, without accusations, without constructing a narrative just to survive its edges. I stand in front of the dresser, adjusting the empty frame until it aligns perfectly with the edge of the wall, the faint reflection of my silhouette shimmering briefly on the glass pane inside it, before dissolving into clear transparency. This frame once held a picture of Daniel and me from a vacation years ago, back when the idea of fracture felt impossible, back when my silence wasn't a survival skill, but a simple comfort. I removed that photo last night and tore it cleanly down the center, watching the image separate into the people we had become rather than the ones we pretended to be. Now the frame holds nothing, and that nothing feels like truth. I take a slow breath, noticing how different I feel in present tense, how the choices I make now no longer orbit around his moods or contradictions. My phone rests on the dresser, not cracked or shattered like his, but still carrying the quiet weight of everything I gathered. I don't need to look at the evidence anymore. I don't need the screenshots, the receipts, the drafts. Those pieces served their purpose, shaping the contours of a story that led me out of his gravity. The apartment hums with gentle morning sounds from outside. Someone walking their dog, a car passing the faint clatter of dishes from a neighboring unit. Life happening without strain, without surveillance, without fear of the next sentence designed to bruise in softness. I walk to the window, sliding my fingertips along the sill, and let the light spill across my hands. In the glass, my reflection appears whole, no fracture, no distortion, just the clean shape of someone who stayed long enough to understand the lie, but not so long that she became part of it. The reflection finally holds its true shape. The motif resolves not in drama, not in confrontation, but in clarity. I blink once, grounding myself in the honesty of the moment. My breathing steadies not because I force it to, but because there is nothing left to brace against. When I turn back toward the room, my eyes fall again on the empty frame, its glass shimmering faintly as though echoing every moment over the past weeks when light revealed what words tried to conceal. I step toward it, lifting it gently, feeling the cool edge of the metal against my palm. It feels lighter than it should, almost fragile. But fragility isn't weakness. It's what allows truth to be seen when illusions shatter. I place the frame on the center of the dresser, anchoring it with a deliberate finality. It stands as a boundary, a declaration, a line Daniel can no longer cross with his versions of reality. He hasn't called since last night. Not yet. He might eventually, out of fear, desperation, habit. But his voice no longer has shape here. It doesn't echo inside these walls. It doesn't bend the air around my decisions. I walk to the kitchen and pour a glass of water, watching the surface ripple slightly before settling. A quiet, stable reflection. I think about how every broken piece, every contradiction, every glow of evidence shaped a path I didn't want but needed. I think about how silence used to shield me, then isolate me, then finally free me. Now it's not silence that defines the room. It's choice. I sit at the small table near the window and let the morning unfold at its own pace. No trembling spoon, no fractured reflections bending around his presence. Just light, just breath, just space. For a moment, I close my eyes and picture myself stepping out of the cafe yesterday, sunlight pooling at my feet, Daniel's voice trailing behind me like a fading echo of a script he no longer controlled. I remember the way people looked at him, not with pity, not with blame, but with recognition. The truth had finally reached the surface. And I had walked away from it without needing to explain myself. I open my eyes again, focusing on the empty frame as it catches another thin beam of light. That space, unfilled, unclaimed promises something I haven't felt in a long time possibility. I don't know what picture will go there next. I don't need to. Today is not about filling empty spaces. It's about allowing them to exist, about letting myself breathe inside them. A soft breeze slips through the open window, brushing against my skin with the gentlest reminder that something new has begun, not by force, not by breaking, but by releasing. I stand again, feeling the floor warm beneath my feet, the stillness of the room anchoring me. And as I move toward the door to step outside for the first time in this new chapter, a final realization settles quietly, cleanly, without tremor. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can place in a frame is nothing at all, because emptiness, when chosen, is its own kind of truth.